I'm Rabbi Todd Zinn. I'm one of the rabbis at Chicago Sinai Congregation. We have the privilege of celebrating our high holiday services in your sanctuary every single year in the fall, and we also have the opportunity, because we're so close. Pastor Sawyer and I do lots of really interesting work together around interfaith relations, around relations between our community, our communities, and other communities in the neighborhood. And so when we were just happened to be meeting in December just to talk, as we regularly do, to kind of think about what programs we're doing and plan out moving forward, she brought this opportunity, and I jumped at it because this is the Hebrew Bible is our Bible. And so we want to give an opportunity to talk about what that means from a Jewish perspective, what that means in my community, in the Jewish community of Sinai, and in Jewish communities around the world. So I'm going to do my best to make my way through some content, but I also want to invite all of you, if at any point you have a question, please feel free to ask your question, to engage in the conversation. Because while sometimes this feels very frontal, I'm standing up here with a microphone and a slideshow. It doesn't have to be. Instead, we can have the opportunity to learn and engage together as a group. So as we said, the Hebrew Bible. So what is the Hebrew Bible is the first question, right? And Ira called it the Old Testament, right? So that's what a lot of people call it, right? That's not what we call it. We would call it the Hebrew Bible if we were talking about it in English. The reason we don't call it the Old Testament is because the word Old Testament suggests that there is a New Testament, right? Which is, your Bible, not ours, right? And so because of that, we're going to call it the Hebrew Bible, right? That doesn't change what's in it, right? But in Hebrew, we actually have a very different name for it. In Hebrew, we call it the Tanakh. That's an acronym. TNK. Can you guys over there see the slides, or can we rotate? Is there a way to rotate this a little bit more? I don't want to break the TV. Okay. It's Tanakh. TNK. It's an acronym, right? So it's an acronym because it's made up of 3 sets of books, right? The first is the Torah. The second set is the Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for the prophets. And the third one is the Ketuvim, or the writings, right? Similar to the way that when you break up the Hebrew Bible in your Bibles, someone that you're sitting with them in front of you right now, right? It's broken up into 3 parts. We break it up into 3 parts. Those 3 parts, however, are different. Right? How we classify and how we order is different, and also some of the books within it are different. Right? The one that's generally the same is Torah. Right? The Torah, sometimes the 5 books of Moses, right, has 5 books. Right? Generally the same 5 books. These are the central books to our study. Each of them has what we would call the English name for it. It's really sometimes Latin, sometimes English, sometimes Greek. Right? Name for them. We also have a Hebrew name for them, and the naming convention is a little different. So the first book of the Bible, all of us would agree, is Genesis. However, in Hebrew, we call it Breshit. So the naming convention, right? Genesis comes, I believe that's a Latin word, right? From like in the beginning, at the start, right? In Hebrew, our naming convention, it's the first word of that book. That's like not it's not a boring word. It's not a normal word. If the first word is we skip to the second word, right? So Breshit means, right, it's actually the very first word of the Bible, and the best way to translate that in English is in the beginning. We're going to talk a little more about what that means in a little while, right? But that's the idea, right? Exodus. Right? Second book of the Bible. It's the story of the, most of that is the stories of the Exodus from Egypt to Egyptian slavery, right? And in Hebrew, however, right? So that's how the English name came about. In Hebrew, however, it's called Shemot. Because if you think about it for a second, at the first chapter of the first book of Exodus, does anybody know what's happening in that first chapter of the first book of Exodus? Right? It's a list of the names of the children of Jacob and their children and it starts with Elah HaShemot. These are the names. Right? And so that's why we call it Shemot. Similarly, like Leviticus, right? The laws, most of which are priestly laws. In Hebrew, we call Vayikra, which means "and God called." The fourth book, Numbers, right? Because it's the book where we start. The beginning begins with a census. In Hebrew, we call Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. Deuteronomy, Devarim, means these words, right? So that we just have a different naming convention, but the actual order of those books is the same, right? That starts changing as we get to the next set of books, right? Because we break ours up into the prophets and the writings, as opposed to what are the other two parts in the Christian Bible, in your Bible, when you break up the Hebrew Bible? It's the histories and the narrative, something like that. Yeah.
We don't use that a lot.
Oh, really?
I kind of applied that to try to conceptualize when I was teaching about it, so I shared that with Rabbi Zinn. Yeah, we don't even break it up conceptually.
When you break up the Hebrew Bible in the Bibles that you use, you don't break it up at all. It's just one the Hebrew Bible.
That's my experience of it. Yeah, it's just the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting.
If I may?
Yeah.
In another church that I was raised in, also a Presbyterian church, I heard about it as the law and the prophets. So it was only broken into two.
Okay. Yeah. So we break ours up into three, right? And so our second section is the prophets, right? Which is the Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, the big prophets, the three big guys, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor, right? We call them the big three. And these ones, and part of this, this is the way they're ordered, right? Right here to the left side and on the right side, in that order. And that order is not historic order, right? You know, Amos is probably the earliest of these prophets, and he's kind of stuck there in the middle there somewhere, right? You know, so like but this is the order, this is the canon that we have, right? And then we have the writings: Psalms, Proverbs, Job's, the 5 scrolls, Ruth, Esther, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. Right? So that's what's in our Bible. Right? How do we get to these books? Why these books and not other books? Right? It has to do with the history of canonization. Right? So we tell a story. We tell a story about the rabbis at Yavne. When the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70, Jewish learning moved to what had been, at the time, building up as the center of rabbinic study towards the end of the Second Temple. It's a place called Yavne. Yavne is a city. It's kind of near the coast in Israel. And it was where like the major schools of learning were, where the major rabbis were at the time. And the story we like to tell is that the rabbis sat down around the year 70 and said, is this in the Bible? And they were voted, and then half their hands went up and half the hands went down, and like, okay, that book's not in the Bible. Right? And they held up, and they were like, Judges, what do you guys think about Judges? And then everybody's hands went up, and they all like, said, okay, cool, Judges is in the Bible. Right? That's the story we like to tell. That is not a true story. But we know that it's around that time period that canonization's happening. Right? The couple of things we know about canonization, right? We know that when the Torah was canonized, there were 24 books of the Bible. Now, if you went back 2 slides and you counted, you would get to more than 24. Because some of those books were singular books, right? Kings was 1 book and not 2. We divided it later. Samuel was 1 book and not 2. The 12 minor prophets were probably combined to either 1 or 2 books, right? But we know that there were 24 books in the Bible. We also know, right, that the Bible was canonized as 3 parts. And we know that from a number of different sources. We know that because we have a Jewish scholar in the 2nd century who said, right, the 2nd century BCE, right, who said the law, the prophets, and the other books. So we know that there's 3 pieces of canon there. The other place we know that there's 3 pieces of canon is from your Bible, right? Because Luke says the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So it suggests that it was canonized in 3 different sections, and that's kind of how we've carried this out in our canon. As the other things we know about canonization, right? We know that it's incredibly unclear as to exactly when it happened. Through all of the scholarship, much of it is just conjecture based on scriptural fragments that people have found that date back, right? Based on fragments found in Qumran and other places, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that suggest that certain books were part of the canon and certain books were not part of the canon. We also know that, right? We know there's three things that, however, that make a lot of sense and that we believe are generally true about the canonization. One, that it's happening around 70 CE. Right? It's happening around the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay? And we know that because that's the time that we start seeing some formalized sort of structure. We also know that because as we start looking at other texts, stuff that came later doesn't end up in our Bible. So the most famous of those that doesn't end up in our Bible and ends up in some other people's Bibles, right, is the book of Maccabees. Not in the Hebrew Bible. Right? Because it was too new. Right? So we still celebrate Hanukkah, right? We celebrate the holiday around the Maccabees, it's not in our Bible. We also know that it probably did not take in any way, shape, or form like the way that I talked about in the story in Yavna. Right? That it was not some group of rabbis sitting up in some study hall somewhere saying, like, this is what's in the Bible, this was not in the Bible, this is what's in the Bible, and this is what's not in the Bible. Right? That it was much more of an organic process happening between different communities that had certain things they were reading. They were saying, these are important books, and other communities saying, these are important books. And as they started to come together and say, we need to figure out what our important books are together, right? Much more of a grassroots process, not a top-down process. And finally, we know that canonization was incredibly inclusive. There is lots of stuff in the Bible that we look back at now as modern Jewish people, and we say, why is that there? Right? We look at Song of Songs, and we're like, and it's beautiful. I don't want to say Song of Songs is not beautiful, but it does not seem to fit in the mold of anything else that's there. Right? We look at books like Daniel, right, or that, right, like don't seem to fit. Books like Ezra and Nehemiah that seem much too recent to fit in. But so we know that they were incredibly inclusive. So when they left something out, like Maccabees, there's probably was a reason for leaving it out. So these are the things that we know, right? This is the scholar's Mark Z. Bretler, right? So the other things that we know, right? The thing that is most important of the Hebrew Bible, the part that's most important is the Torah. I don't want to say the other parts are not important, but the Torah is by far the most important. Right? The Torah is what we read every single week. The Torah is, we divide the Torah up into 54 sections, and we read one section of it every single week. How do you read 54 sections over the course of a year? Well, that's Jewish calendar stuff, right? But we start reading in Genesis in the fall, and we slowly make our way it's usually a couple of chapters. Sometimes it's one chapter, sometimes it's 3 or 4 chapters or 5 chapters, 6 chapters at a time every single week until we get to the end in the fall and then start again start right up again. There's no break between the readings. We actually have a holiday in which we finish and start at exactly the same moment. We read the last couple words and then we immediately switch to the first couple words. Because this process of learning Torah is incredibly inclusive and it's constantly ongoing. So we have this cyclical cycle of reading through it. Right now, yesterday, we read, we're in the middle of Exodus right now. So yesterday, we read the final 3 plagues. And we started, and the death of the firstborn, and then it talks about, how do you actually celebrate the holiday of Pesach, the holiday of Passover. And this coming week, we're going to read about, the splitting of the sea and the song of the sea. Right? So we're slowly making our way through. Yes?
Do you mean you read them in synagogue or you read them individually every day of the week?
Yes. So the tradition is that we will read it in synagogue. Right? So we read Torah publicly. We read it on Saturday mornings. Right? We will read the entire section. There's also a tradition of reading it on Monday and Thursday mornings as well. So that traditionally it would be in synagogue. That's not a thing that we do. Thank you. not going to trip. That's not a thing we actually do at Sinai, but it's a traditional thing, right? And it actually comes from Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah are the people who instituted the Torah service. And they instituted the tradition of us reading Torah publicly and having it broken up into different sections. And they said, like, this is how you do it, and this is the ritual that goes along with it. And so on Saturday mornings, we'll read the entire thing. Right? So many people will read part of it or at home, or read commentaries about it at home over the course of the week. Right? And on Saturday morning, we come together and we sit, we read it publicly. We also, that's when we study it as a group, right? We have Torah study every Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. Hopefully that answers your question, right? And we read it on Saturday, and then we start again with the next section on Sunday, right? Our week is Sunday to Saturday. Yes.
Is it always the same sections year after year, or do they change it slightly? And also, do all Jewish congregations worldwide do the same thing, or do different organizations have their own divisions? In other words, is it a commonality among the entire Jewish people of the world?
So the short answer is yes. We read the exact same sections, right? And so and it follows a Jewish calendar. So we'll read the same sections in the same order and the same divisions in the same order, right? So for the first 2 weeks ago, we read the first 7 plagues, and then it breaks at the end of the 7th plague, and then we read the last 3 plagues the next week. That order is standardized across the Jewish world. And that might not always fall on Super Bowl weekend, right? Because the Jewish calendar, the way it falls is it sometimes falls, the holidays sometimes come a little bit earlier, sometimes come a little bit later, right? The reason there's 54 is because in the Jewish calendar, we follow a lunar calendar, and there's 50 weeks in a Jewish year, except when there's 54 weeks in a Jewish year. We have a leap year as well in order to keep ourselves on a constant cycle. So similar to in the Muslim community also follows a lunar calendar, but they don't have a leap year. Because most of our holidays are very connected into agriculture, into the agricultural seasons. And so they need to see, you can't have your planting holiday in the middle of the winter, right? You can't have your harvest holiday in the middle of the summer, right? So you need to be somewhere. And so the way that the rabbis figured out to do that is by instituting a leap year. And
so the leap year won't be in the regular leap year that we are going to have this year is not.
It's not our leap year, exactly. Because in the Gregorian leap year, right, you add 1 day. In the Jewish leap year, we add 1 month. And in the Gregorian leap year, it's once every 4 years. In the Jewish leap year, it's like this random cycle every 50 years where it's the 3rd, the 4th, the 12th, the 16th. I don't know. Actually, I have no idea. Somebody tells me it's a leap year, and I follow, and I believe them. But it's not a standardized cycle the same way it is. And so in order to make that work, we have 54 Torah portions. So on a leap year, we're able to spread all 54, read 1 each week. In a regular year, where there's only 50 weeks, we combine 8 of them into 4. That makes sense. And that standardization is actually also standardized across the Jewish world, right? Similar to the way this canon is standardized, the way we read Torah is standardized.
That transition holiday is Simchat Torah?
Yeah, exactly. So exactly, good job, right? So exactly, the holiday that we transition from the end of the Torah to the beginning of the Torah happens about 2 weeks after Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, and we call it Simchat Torah, which literally means the joy of Torah. And it's a holiday to celebrate the fact that we just finished reading the Torah, and we're super excited to get started reading it again.
I wish we did that here.
So how long ago did that tradition start?
The holiday of Simchat Torah?
No, the tradition of reading the Torah and the 54 sections.
Yeah, so that part of the Torah dates back to Ezra and Nehemiah. And so I don't have my dates on Ezra and Nehemiah in the top of my head, but that Ezra instituted the tradition of reading Torah and reading Torah publicly. And prior to him, we read it on Saturdays. And part of the reason we started reading, we read it on Mondays and Thursdays, is because during those times, those were the market days. No one would be able to come in to the city and hear the Torah read on Saturday, because Saturday was Shabbos. They weren't able to come in. And so, he started instead well, you guys got to hear the Torah read too. And if you can't come in from your fields Right? What day are you already coming in? You're already coming in on market days, on Tuesdays and on Mondays and Thursdays. And so we continue to read it on Mondays and Thursdays.
Would that predate or post-date Jesus?
So that would predate Jesus, right? That would predate Jesus, and that also has to tell us about something about canonization too, right? Because we said canonization doesn't happen until afterwards, right? But we already have the Torah, those 5 books, as being canonized, as something standardized well before. Right? It wasn't until later that we get all the other books added onto it as part of a larger corpus of Bible. Right? And when we read Torah on a weekly basis, we're reading from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We're reading from the Torah. Right? We also will often read a small section from the prophets as well. That, however, is not standardized at all. If you're from Yemen, you read a different section. If you're from Eastern Europe, you read a different section. If you're from North Africa, you read a different section. If you follow this rabbi, you read, like, it's supposed to be a section of the prophets that somehow relates to the Torah portion, right? And that didn't come till much, much, much later. Yes?
Is Leviticus, is it really hardest book of all the Jewish law? I mean, really the most difficult discipline.
I wouldn't call it the hardest.
By really the hardest, I mean really just living your lives as Jewish people in the law.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, right? So Leviticus has a lot of laws, right? It's a lot of laws. A lot of laws, and many of those laws we don't follow still today, right? Because a lot of those laws are about sacrifices, right? And we don't do that, right? We do think it's important to study it because there's something really important to learn from those laws, right? And then the other sets of laws that are in Leviticus is the holiness code. It says that the priests, this you shall be holy because I, the eternal your God, am holy. Leviticus 19. Right? And that's incredibly important, and that is also incredibly difficult because those are laws about interpersonal relationships, and how do we be holy, right? So I would not say one is more important, more difficult, right? Yes, it's a lot easier to follow the laws that are in Genesis because there's not a lot of laws in Genesis, right? But so it's a different kind of understanding, but yeah. Okay. Yes.
Now, when you're reading in the synagogue, I assume you're reading in English or are you reading in Hebrew?
Hebrew. Yeah. So we're reading. So we're reading in Hebrew. So in some synagogues, in our synagogue, we also translate it into English because we know most people don't actually speak Hebrew, don't actually understand Hebrew. But when we're reading, so yesterday, right? Yesterday, there was a young woman who became bat mitzvah, which in Jewish tradition is becoming of age. Right? And she got up, she's 13 years old, and she got up and she read, she didn't read the whole portion, but she read, a couple chapters, or a couple paragraphs in Hebrew. Right? From she read about the plague of darkness. Right? And that's so exactly. So we're reading it in Hebrew because that's what it is. And we're reading it from the Torah scroll. So the picture up there is the Torah scroll. Right? We also have the Torah in books like you guys do, right? But when we read it as part of our ritual, as part of our service, we read it out of an ancient scroll.
And when at Temple Sinai, do you read or chant?
We read and chant. So chanting is instituted by Ezra and Nehemiah. We read it. And we read the. I use the word read colloquially. To mean both. Chanting was instituted because, if you're standing in the middle of the market square, right, and you're trying to communicate something to a huge group of people and you don't have a microphone with you, right? One, you can be a lot louder if you're chanting. And two, chanting was supposed to help emphasize certain words and phrases, act almost as like punctuation. And so we chant. Yeah, it's like sing-songy.
Or it's not, it's just straight.
It's like a sing-songy, right? So,
No, it's just a straight chant.
yeah, I would. So,
Like you and I.
I'm gonna give you my example, and I'm gonna apologize for my terrible voice in this moment. But in a couple of minutes, we're gonna look at Genesis 1:1, right? In the Hebrew, it says, "Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz." First sentence. That's literally the first sentence of the Bible. Right? That's one of the few I have memorized. And there's a chant. So like when I get up and I read Torah, I often read. I, however, can chant. And so, the first sentence of Genesis. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ve'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu ve'choshech al panei tehom. That's the first two sentences. Right? But like the idea is like we're chanting it. There's a sing-song portion to it, right? But we're also trying to communicate different like punctuation and the ideas behind it. Yeah.
Ezra, I can't say the second name.
Nehemiah.
Yes, that. Is that Ezra of the?
Yep.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yep.
I just wanted to.
I mean, and so right, Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the governor. Ezra was the priest, right? When the Israelites came back from Babylon. Right? And they helped institute a lot of the laws about how do you live back in the land, right? And that's why like they're while in some ways they were political figures, right? In other ways like that's why their books are in our Bible, because they were these religious leaders of that time period. So we're going to talk about Torah for a while. So a couple of you have referred to Torah as the law. That's from the English or from the Greek nomos. It's a terrible translation. Right? Sometimes we hear Torah referred to as Pentateuch. Again, 5 books. Also, not a very good translation. The word Torah is a really difficult word to translate. We often translate the word Torah as Torah, which I know is not helpful for people who don't speak Hebrew. But Torah, probably the best translations, right? Hebrew has root words, right? The root has to do with shooting, hitting the mark. And the best translation is calling it the teaching or the instruction. Right? Torah is what God has to teach us. Torah is the instructions for how to live our lives. Right? Torah, to call it the law is to probably oversimplify it, and it's also to understand what the people who are translating it originally, how they understood it. Right? They were focused primarily on on those legal aspects of it. This really difficult stuff in Leviticus.
Does that teach the afterlife, that there's an afterlife?
That's a great question. That's a great question. That context does not exist within the Hebrew Bible. Jewish understandings of the afterlife are incredibly complicated, and I can go into great depth. But the short answer is, if it exists, we believe it. Well, so I mean, like, so this is when it becomes really, really difficult to say, like, does Judaism believe X? Does Judaism believe Y? Especially with big topics like this, whether it's, I would say, God, afterlife, heaven, right? Any of those sorts of like really big topics. Does Judaism believe? Judaism believes lots of stuff, right? And there's groups of people in a tradition that stretches thousands of years and has a huge diversity of understandings of lots of things, right? There's people within Judaism, there's texts in Judaism that believe in resurrection. Absolutely. And there's texts within Judaism that believe in heaven and hell. Absolutely. We have words for that. We have texts in our tradition, right? There's texts in Jewish tradition that believe that when you die, you die. All of that exists within Jewish tradition. So to say, like, does Judaism believe something is really difficult. Okay. Understanding the Torah. What is the Torah? Who wrote the Torah? The Torah is a book that has its origins in the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. There's plenty of people who believe that God wrote the Bible. God communicated it to Moses, and Moses wrote it down, and God wrote it. There's plenty of Jewish people who believe that. As a rabbi at Chicago Sinai congregation, as a liberal Reformed Jew, right? Now I use those words not in the political connotations, but in the connotations here, right? That's not something I believe. Right? Firmly believe that the Bible was written by people. And so if we believe that the Bible was written by people, right, there's many people who disregard that assumption, the Bible was written by people, and say instead the Bible was written by God. God, the word of God is given to Moses from God. And if you believe that, right, you then have to, that gives great meaning to the Torah, the Jewish Bible. But then you start getting into problems of okay, well, the world was created in 7 days. Right? What does that mean for the world to be created in 7 days? In Genesis 1, but then in Genesis 2, it says something different about the way the world was created. And then you get into great conflicts of science and religion, right? If you believe that the people wrote the Bible, that's not the conflict you have. The conflict you have is you have to then say, okay, then what makes the Torah special? What makes the Torah important? Right? And we have to ask ourselves two questions, right? What's God's relationship to the Bible? And why, then, is the Bible more significant than any other piece of literature? There's plenty of people who say lots of books are important, right? There's lots of things we can gain from stuff. And they will study it like religious texts. There's a group of people out of Harvard right now that are reading Harry Potter, right, like it's a religious text. They have a very popular podcast. And you're able to do that, right? But what sets this book up, aside from Harry Potter, if we both believe they were written by people, right? It's an interesting question to ask, right? So we need to answer those two questions, right? What does God have to do with the Torah? How is the Torah different from any other significant literature of the past? What does God have to do with the Torah? Right? While God is not the author of the Torah, as in God did not write it down, God did not give the words to Moses, and then Moses wrote it down, right? The Torah is the most important book as to understand humans' interactions with the divine. How we as people understand God and how we as people interact with God. And then what makes the Torah different? What makes the Torah special than any other book from the past? It's because we say it is. It's because for millennia, for thousands of years, people have said, this is the book that teaches us how to live our lives, that teaches us about our history, that teaches us about the world, that teaches us about our understanding with God, our communication with God, our relationship with God. And it's those two things, it's all the meaning that we've given it that make it, therefore, meaningful. It's a complicated, I think, nuance to figure out. Because we could say any book is important, right? We could agree with and say Harry Potter is really important. We have a lot to learn from Harry Potter, and I agree. We probably do have a lot to learn from Harry Potter, right? But was not written as an individual or a group of individuals trying to communicate with the divine, trying to understand the divine. And it's only been around for 10 years. Right? And it therefore does not hold the historical significance of a book.
I felt that part of the Torah was written while in exile, while the Jews were in exile. Since the exilic story is so important to Judaism.
Yeah. So I would say that the Torah itself, right? 5 books of Moses, no. Right, because we believe that the most recent book of the Torah is Deuteronomy, right, which comes before the destruction of the first temple. Other books, for sure, did, right? Because Ezekiel tells stories about being in exile in Babylon, and so those books had to have been written afterwards. These are the words of Rabbi Gunther Plaut. Rabbi Plaut is a really important rabbi. He was the rabbi in Oak Park for a long time, before he was in Toronto, where he finished his career. And so then we have how was the Bible written, right? And the most common way to understand that is to understand it as 4 authors. It's a thing called documentary hypothesis. It's a theory that was developed in the 80s and has continued to be developed. There were 4 primary authors of the Bible. There's some other authors as well. These are either individuals or groups. Some believe that some of them are individuals. Some believe that some of them are groups, depending upon how we interpret them. There's lots of literature about who they were and what period they came from, right, and how it was redacted. Right? But basically, we're saying, right, this helps clear up some of the stuff that's difficult to understand. Right? Some of the stuff that conflicts with itself. The easiest way to think about that is to think about Genesis. Genesis 1 tells us one story of creation. Right? And if we think about the story of Genesis 1, how would you describe that story, right? The world was created in 7 days. It's incredibly repetitious, right? Over and over again, right? And there was evening and there was morning the first day, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. Right? It lays out God as this really incredibly powerful creator, because in the first book of Genesis, how does God create? Out of chaos. And God speaks with God's words, right? And so it's a different kind of incredibly powerful creator, right? And so we believe, right, that Genesis 1 through the beginning of Genesis 2, right, where that first story of creation comes from the priestly writer, right? Because we know that the priestly writer was incredibly repetitious, said things over and over again. We know that the priestly writer really wrote a lot in poetry. We know that the priestly writer was really concerned with the origins of all sorts of things, whether it's the origins of ritual, as we see later in Leviticus, right, or the origins of the world. We also know that the priestly writer saw God as majestic and powerful, able to create with words. Then we have the second story of creation, Genesis 2. Right? The second story of creation starts in the second chapter of Genesis, really continues for a couple of chapters. And if we think about that story, what are the things we think about when we think about that story? Right? We think about the Garden of Eden. Right? And when God creates Adam in Genesis 2, how does God create Adam? We have a story of a rib, right? That's how, right? We have a story of God collecting the earth, right, and breathing into life. And then we have a story of taking a rib out of Adam and creating Eve, which is very different than creating with words. It also doesn't have the poetic imagery that the first story has. Right? It's much more of like a tactile story and narrative. Right? And that's what we know about this second source, right? The Yahwehist, right? We know that, right? This person is named, right? They're there because they tend to use the tetragrammaton, right? The four-letter name for God as their name for God when they write. We know because they understand God as very anthropomorphic. God having very human characteristics, creating, breathing. Right? It also, this particular writer tends to write with a significant distinction between God and human beings. God doing something and then human beings doing something, and God and human beings in conflict with each other. This writer also very much believes that humanity corrupts God's creation. And so we see that in the way that Adam and Eve interact with God and are punished by God. This is the Yahwehist. Right? So this is just an example of the four authors. These are juxtaposing two of them. Right? The Elohimist is understood to generally use the name Elohim as the name for God in the Hebrew. Right? There's some other interesting stuff about that one. Then the Deuteronomist is the most recent one, wrote much of Deuteronomy, and it's understood. Deuteronomy is understood to be a much more recent book of the Torah. So, how we read the Bible. Robert Alter is probably the most important Jewish Bible translator in modern times. He's a professor at UC Berkeley. And he writes about how really every single translation is terrible. He just wrote his own translation of the entire Hebrew Bible, right, from Genesis all the way through Chronicles, right? It's really interesting. He's got some interesting stuff in there. But he says there's two real problems with it. Some of our translators didn't really understand Hebrew. Right? They have a shaky understanding of Hebrew. And some of our translators have a terrible understanding of English. And so those two things in concert with each other, right, make translation really difficult. It's cliche to say that every translation is also a betrayal, but it's true. Every translation is also really bad, and every translation communicates what the authors of the translation were thinking. So to play that out, give us an example, right? That's probably that slide's in the wrong spot. So this is the first verse of Genesis. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Does anybody off the top of their heads want to know the translation that you know for this verse? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. In the beginning, God created heaven and the heaven and the earth. Right? King James. Right? The most famous translation of the Bible that has ever existed. Right? Is that correct? Who knows? Who knows? Right? Because then we have them come back in the New King James and the RSV, right? The Revised Standard Version, right? And they come back and they made one change. What's the one change they made between these two versions in this one verse? Heavens. They made one change in this verse. Right? And we're just going to do this, and that we could use any verse in the Bible. This is the first one, right? To use this as an example. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Are those two sentences different significantly? Well, there's one letter that's different. The S, the heavens, the S is so it's, in some ways it's really insignificant. It's one letter. But theologically, are they different? Yeah. Yeah.
What is that difference?
So, right, thinking about, right, God created the heaven up above and then the earth down below. Or God created multiple heavens. What would that mean for there to be multiple heavens? Right? Right? And but only one earth? It's a really interesting theological thing to play out. How would that be different? And then you go back and look at the Hebrew, right? The Hebrew, shamayim. Is it plural? It is plural. It is plural, right? The im, the ending, right? Right? At the end, it means it's plural. So is it plural? Yeah, it's plural. Right? But it's also, right, there's no singular version of that word. There's no singular. You cannot say, if you wanted to say sky, shamayim. Right? Yeah, it's that word there's no singular version of that word. Right? There are other words that mean the same thing, synonyms that are singular, right? But that version of that word, it doesn't come in singular. It only comes in shamayim. So therefore, you could actually translate it as heaven, or you could translate it as heavens. And both of those would be correct. So the NRSV made a change too. From the King James, right? They kept, to the New King James, they added the S. They kept the S, and they added one more word. What's the word? When. Another small change, 4 letters. But does that theologically change the meaning of the sentence? Significantly. Right? Oh, it's a clause. Thank you. Thank you. I failed grammar class. Bara is the word for created. We're actually So, right? Exactly. So, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Right? So we could be in the beginning, when it all began, God was doing the creating, started right away, creating. Or in the beginning creation already happened, and then when God decided, okay, cool, now I'm going to start doing the creating, totally changes the meaning of the sentence. Totally changes the meaning of the sentence. The Common English Bible. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, starts really making significant changes. Yeah, exactly. Was that in the beginning? I don't know. I think they're getting the when from et. I think they're getting it from the et participle here. No, the v is and, right here. I think they're getting the when from et. But it's also, it's part of the reason that it's such a hard sentence to translate is this first word, Bereshit. The Latin for that word, I believe, is hapaxagamenon. Right? Does anybody know what that means? It is a word that, Reagan knows what it means. It is a word that is only in the Bible once. It is a word that is only in the Bible once. So it becomes really difficult to translate. Right? It's amongst the things that make this really challenging to understand. Right? So these are all Christian translations. We have lots of Jewish translations too. We don't have as many, but Jewish English translations. Yeah. There's only one version of the Hebrew. So, yeah, there's a standard version of the Hebrew. It's the Masoretic text. That's what we use, and that's what everything is. So every Bible is the same. The Hebrew's always, yeah. Okay. So then we have Hebrew to English translations, right? JPS, the Jewish Publication Society. That's who they did a translation in 1917, which is a version of the King James, really. It's the King James with I've been told once that there are 40,000 changes from the King James to the for the JPS 1917, and if you look at that first sentence, it's exactly the same. Right?
Considering how many words there are, 40,000 doesn't strike me.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, like to think exactly 40,000 is a lot. 40,000 is also not a huge number, right? And then exactly. So and then JPS did an update in 1985. Right? Wow. Yeah. Right? So like they make it like and these changes are really significant changes, right? There's other translations that are also in like Jewish translations in more recently. I referred to the altar. The altar and is very similar to the JPS in this particular verse, so I chose not to include it. But Everett Fox is a really significant translator. Wrote an English translation of the Hebrew Bible in the 90s. Huge difference. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, right? Like we're getting into it, right? And so, and then Richard Friedman, who's best known for much of his work on documentary hypothesis, right? In the beginning of God's creating the skies. That word Shemayim, which everybody else translated as heaven, means sky. If you looked out today, you could very easily say the sky is blue, right? For the first time in like 3 months. You could very easily use the word Shemayim. That's the word that means sky. Okay? So we think a lot about translation and about what this means. Right? And so I want to pull us back one slide. Right? So when we read the Bible, we generally read it in 4 steps. Pardes is a Hebrew word. It means orchard. And the idea is that you're walking to an orchard and there's really big things you can look at. You can look at the trees. Right? You can look at the way the orchard as a whole looks. Or you can start really like pulling in at very, very tiny little things, at individual leaves, right? At fruit, at the roots, at one root on one tree. And that's how we understand the Bible, right? Sometimes you need to start big. So there's 4 steps. It's also an acronym. Pshat, it's the direct meaning. We just read the verse, and we could spend hours talking about that verse and those translations and heaven versus heavens and what that could possibly mean theologically. And we could spend a whole bunch of time talking about when or at the beginning. And that's the pshat, that's the direct translation, the simple basic reading, and what we can get from that. Then we go into remez, which is the deep meaning. And we start looking at commentators. Because we never read the Bible, we rarely read the Bible. I don't sit down with the Bible and just read it. You always read it in light of what other people have said about it prior to you. You have drash, which is the comparative, the allegorical part of it. What are we here to learn from it? What's its larger teaching based on this verse, based on this story? And the secret meaning, the esoteric or the mystical reading. What does Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, have to teach about it? Right? What sorts of things are buried deep in the text that we can only access if we have a large base of knowledge prior to? Right? So to give us an example, I'm going to pull us one more slide. To give us an example, this is one of the very traditional ways that we read the Bible. I know all of you can read this. So this is a photocopy or a scan or an image of a book called Mikra Ot Gedolot, which means the great commentators. And this is a Hebrew one. English versions of this exist as well. I could not find a copy of the English version in a JPEG on the internet. So we went with Hebrew, right? And so if you look at this, there's a bunch of different things, and it's all divided up, right? It starts with with the text. This happens to be Exodus, right? A couple of lines of Exodus, right? Just because that's where the text is. And then we have a translation of the text, right? Onkelos is the most common translation. It's actually an Aramaic translation of the text. Right? What does it say? Right? In more modern words. And then if you look around the outside are commentators. What do other people have to say about this text? And these are all medieval commentators. That's who's traditionally in Mikro Gedolot. This is Rashi. Rashi is probably the most significant Jewish commentator in the history of Jewish commentators. The story that we tell about Rashi is that Rashi's wife came up to Rashi and said, "Rashi, what do you think about how I look right now?" And Rashi said, "Well, your dress doesn't match your earrings, and you should probably redo your hair, and I think those shoes probably you want a heel, not a flat, right?" And so Rashi's wife says, right, "Rashi, do you really need to commentate on everything?" And that's Rashi. Rashi is an incredible individual. He was also a vintner. He made wine. He only had daughters. He's a fascinating character. But we have these various commentators, right? All from around the same general time period of the Middle Ages, all from kind of like different parts of the world, right? Each of which who has a different perspective, right? So we have Rashi, we have Ibn Ezra, right? We have Sforno, right? There's like all of these different commentators that are on the Bible, and then we pulled them into a single book, right? So we can understand and oftentimes Nachmanides really often disagrees with Rashi, which I really appreciate. Right? And there's other commentators as well who these four are pretty standard. There's other commentators as well who all have different opinions and different perspectives, right? Things that they want to add to the conversation. And in some versions of this book, different commentators will exist. You might have a Maimonides in one of them, right? A Radak is a really common guy to have in them, right? Like there's these different medieval commentators. So what are they saying, right? So here's the first verse of the Bible. And what does Rashi have to say? Rashi's question is, well, why is this the first verse of the Bible? In the beginning? Why would you start with in the beginning? If this is supposed to be a book of law, of tradition, shouldn't we start with the first law? In Exodus 12, which we read this week, it says, on the first of the month shall be unto you the first of the months. It says the first of the months. First of the month? Then that's the first verse of the Bible. That should be the first verse of the Bible, right? Because it says the beginning. So why do we have to have 62 chapters that came before it? Why can't we just start there in Exodus? He asks the question, and then in Rashi's way, he gives his answer. Right? He says, I think, it's there to lay out a background and to say, here's the tradition, and here's how we got here, right? Because we just started here. This could be just any book of laws. Right? Each of them is going to point to. Some of them are then going to point to the same thing. People are going to respond to what Rashi said. People might point to a different word or a different part of the verse, right? Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi really likes. He wants to talk about the Hebrew word bara, right? And what that means, that only God can bara, only God can use the verse to bara, to create. Right? Even Ezra, right, talks about, do we really need to say in the beginning? Couldn't we just say beginning? Right? What does that mean that we're saying in the beginning? Right? And then we even have modern commentators who is really important for us to read. Right? All of those previous people, right? There's something very similar about all of those people who came before in the Middle Ages, right? They're all men. And it's really important for us to understand both through a modern lens and through a female lens what's going on. Rabbi Eskenazi is a rabbi in Los Angeles. She wrote the Torah women's commentary that I'm a big fan of. And she asks the same question. So what's the deal with the Genesis 1:1? Right? And she starts talking about how what's the purpose of these verses? Right? And that's the remez, that's the next level down. And then we start getting into this drosh level, right? This like allegorical reading of the Bible. Right? This is Genesis Rabbah. It's a midrash. It's the most significant compilation of midrashim. It's anonymously written, so we don't actually know who wrote it, but we know that it was in the 5th century. Right? And it starts telling this like fascinating story about how if God said, God created, did God actually create? And then, used as an allegory for human creation. And what could we possibly learn from human creation? And architects and ink and tablets. And then he says, but the word reshit, it says reshit. And just like Ibn Ezra said, well, why is the ba there? Right? That could be just extraneous. It just could mean reshit. He says, right, reshit actually means wisdom. Because if you look at this other verse and another point in the Bible where they use the word reshit and it means wisdom, and so it says, with wisdom God created the world. And what can we learn from that? Right? And that's the next level. And then and then there's another level down, right? We're not going to go into that other level down because that's esoteric and it's really hard. It's hard for me to understand. But that's the way in which we're reading the Hebrew Bible. So I have 3 minutes. But I'll take a couple questions as best as I can.
Has the Torah been translated into modern Hebrew for secular Jews who maybe do not have a familiarity with the ancient Hebrew?
My guess is yes. It's gonna be my guess. I don't actually I don't know for sure, but it would make sense too, right? Ancient biblical Hebrew is very different than modern Hebrew. It's almost like 2 different languages. Right? So I would assume it has been. That's a great question.
Do the Psalms play a role in services? I mean, it's often one of the books here that in a Christian tradition
Yeah. So we use Psalms a lot in our liturgy, probably in a similar way to the way that you use Psalms, right, in liturgy. We have Psalms that there's a series of 8 Psalms that we read on Friday night before. At the beginning of the Friday night service, right, welcoming the Sabbath, crossing the week. There's Psalms that we read. We read Psalm 23, right, which is a psalm that I'm sure you read. We read it at gravesides, right. So yeah, so those play out. We don't read Psalms in services the same way we read Torah, but it's much more of a liturgical piece.
Is there a big difference in the way the Orthodox read Torah compared to your congregation?
So I think the big difference is that they would understand it as the Word of God. The Word of God. In the same way that I think probably some traditional conservative Christian churches would understand it as the Word of God. But outside of that, right, there's some things that we might not do. So like we at Sinai don't read Torah on Mondays and Thursdays, right? We just don't have that service, right? So but they're going to have that service, right? We might, only read a part of the Torah portion. They're going to read the whole thing, right? So there's little differences, but the big difference is the Word of God.
Are the Psalms used as part of the commentaries? I know that's a wide category, but particularly with the Genesis creation story, the best commentary I think I ever heard to explain it and to get over the conflict between religion and science was in, I believe it's Psalm 90, 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening log.
Yeah, so I think sometimes one of the things the rabbis really like to do is they like to pull at the Psalms and say look at what's in the Psalms and how does that relate to it. So I'm going to give an example, right? Which is very similar to the thing you said, right? We have the 10 plagues, right? 10 plagues. Dam, Svarde, Kinit, right? Blood, frogs. I don't know the other ones in English in order. Lice is 3. I don't know. Kinim, yeah, lice. Right? But if you look at the Psalms, those plagues are mentioned twice in the Psalms, right? I think it's. I was looking at this last week. That's why I know this, right? I think it's like Psalm 85, and I think it's like Psalm 1 something, which doesn't help you at all. But it's mentioned twice in the Psalms, right? Each time they're mentioned in the Psalms, there are not 10 plagues. There are 7 plagues. And each time they're mentioned in the Psalms, they're mentioned, the different 7 plagues are mentioned and in a different order, right? So like the rabbis would point to that and say like, whoa, what's here, right? And what do we have to learn from this? And what, and right, like, you know, and what might this tell us? And right, and like there's some really interesting stuff there. A modern commentator might look at that and say, well, what does that tell us about documentary hypothesis and who wrote the Bible, and who wrote Psalms? Right? So like there's lots of things in there, but exactly. So we will often look at other parts of the Bible in order to help us understand what's going on in the Torah, whether it's looking at the Psalms or other stuff, right? They'll often pull out things. So if you looked back at, I don't remember which one it was, right? But one of these previous commentators quoted a verse of the Bible that was totally different from Psalms, right there, Psalm 111, right? So, yeah. Exactly.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Zinn.
Exactly. Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here.